In 1700, the Great Northern War started. This was a war centered around Sweden, who was fighting a coalition of Russia, Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark, Norway. The Swedes had made themselves a great empire in the previous decades. This would all come crumbling down in the next 2 decades. In this war, the Swedish initially were winning, with their king living for war and the Swedish army's quality being far superior to any of its enemies. The Swedes eventually lost after the Swedish king led a failed invasion into Russia. After this failed invasion, the Swedes lost the war, and from this point on, the Swedes were never really a major power. What if this changed? In November of 1700, the Russians lost the Battle of Narva. After this defeat, the Russian army was in no fighting shape. Instead of capitalizing on this victory and invading Russia, the Swedes then focused on Poland-Lithuania. All we need to change is the Swedish king not focusing on the Poles and invading Russia. After winning in Narva, the Swedish king makes quick work of the Russians and seizes Moscow, along with capturing Peter the Great and forcing the Russians to surrender. This would be in 1703. After defeating the Russians, the king of Sweden would focus on Poland-Lithuania. This would go just about as it did historically, with the Swedes rolling over the Poles and the situation in Denmark being quite similar. The peace deal. In the peace, the Swedes would take Norway, the Polish Baltic, Danzig, Karelia, and general Russian lands, including Novgorod, from the Russians. The Swedes would also keep Peter the Great hostage, so the Russians would have to install a new monarch. The consequences of this would be immense. The Swedish economy would go a lot bigger because of how much Baltic trade they would control. The Russians would be greatly weakened and deprived of a great leader that was historically looked up to. The Polish nobles would likely lose power because the Swedish king would see the writing on the wall and see a need to reform. And the Swedish would just be generally weakened in favor of a stronger Sweden. Future consequences. The Swedes would remain a great power, expanding further into Germany while not getting involved in any major wars. The Russians would be hurt most from this war. This would be because they wanted to get a Baltic port from this war, but them losing would result in the Russian people losing confidence in the Russian monarchy. This would eventually cause them to become a republic. In this timeline, Russia would be smaller but more industrialized and wealthy. The situation in Poland would be very similar to Russia. Instead of being an elective monarchy, they would be an absolute monarchy. This would be because of a loss of confidence in the elective monarchy. Even though the Poles would have lost land in this war, they would, in the long term, be more powerful. One potential outcome. There's a chance a partition of Russia happens. This would be similar to the partition of Poland, with a large reason for it happening, being the Russians being a monarchy. The partition wouldn't really be a partition, more a coalition. It would consist of the Swedes, Ottomans, and Poles. The Russians would just lose land to all parties involved. A majority of it would go to the Poles. Alternate Napoleonic Wars. In the situation where Russia is partitioned, Napoleon would completely steamroll the continent, with Poland somewhat filling Russia's role. Napoleon would likely fall later in this timeline because of this lack of a powerful Russia, which would mean he wouldn't lose hundreds of thousands of his troops in his Russian campaign. I won't go any further into this outcome because I find it relatively unlikely. At this point, I will mention that I don't really see a partition of Poland happening in this scenario because of a much weaker Russia. But it would affect so much, and it would just be a lot of work to integrate it into the scenario. So for my sake, I'm going to say it happens. I'm kind of going to brush over the Napoleonic Wars, but the Swedish would likely be a large part of Napoleon's downfall. In the Treaty of Vienna, the Swedish would get even more German land, at this point having established themselves a very nice domain. From the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Swedes would stay out of major European wars and focus on themselves. The rest of the peace treaty would likely be the same. Swedish politics/economics. The Swedish in this time would industrialize faster. This would be because of more people, a higher income, and more resources. The Swedish economy would be similar to Belgium but slightly less industrialized, and with a population just over triple the Belgians, about 12 to 16 million. This would mean their economy would be similar to that of Austria and Italy. The Swedes would be on the cusp of a great power. This would change to a degree during the latter half of the 19th century. This would be because of immigration. Sweden would be seen as a wealthy state with plenty of job opportunities, which would cause people to immigrate. In the 19th century, Sweden would be liberalizing, possibly even becoming a democracy. This would be with the support of a quickly growing middle class. Overall, during a majority of the 19th century, Sweden would be liberalizing, industrializing, and assimilating their population. This would be through schools, forcing non-Swedes to speak Swedish. In the scramble of Africa, Sweden would likely be invited to the Berlin Conference, possibly getting the Congo instead of Belgium. This would be a reasonably controversial decision, but Paris and London would back a blue Congo while Berlin would support a yellow one. World War I. In this war, the Swedes would start off neutral with no obligations for any side. This being said, they would heavily lean towards the having similar governments. In this war, the Germans would also be deprived of some of their industry and population and be weaker. This being said, Russia would also be weaker. They would eventually side with the Entente in 1916. This would be with promised British financial support and promised North German/Baltic Sea land. The Swedish joining the war would completely alter the course of the war. The Swedes owned some northern Germany, which the Germans would have to divert troops to the front. The Swedes would also send men to the Russian and Western fronts. The Swedes were also a vital source of iron for the German war effort in World War I, so them joining would also greatly weaken the German war effort. The Swedes joining would also allow a way for the Western powers to send supplies to the Russians. All of this combined would mean the Central Powers would surrender sometime in 1917. So there's also a chance the Americans don't join the war, and if they did, they would have much less say in the peace terms. I would just say that in this alternate history, Russia never turns red, and the Americans don't join the war. Both of these combined would mean the peace terms on the Germans would be a lot harsher. The Russians would also have a say in the peace terms. In this peace deal, the Russians would get Galicia, Armenia, German-Polish lands, and possibly the Strait of Constantinople. The Danish would get Holstein, the French would get the Rhineland, and the Swedes would get more of northern Germany. Austria-Hungary might still exist in this time. If they were still on the map, they would lose Transylvania, some land to Italy, land to Serbia, to form Yugoslavia, along with an independent Hungary being created that would control Slovakia. The Ottomans would be divided the same, but with a Russian Armenia and no Constantinople. If the Russians try to enforce their demands, there's a chance that the Turkish War of Independence fails, and Greece and Italy gain some Turkish lands they were supposed to get. This is where I'll end this alternate history.